There are some places in the world that are hotbeds for political and historical activity. These places may seem quiet on the outside, but secrets are lurking within. Since it's October, I'll use the metaphor of a haunted house. From the outside, it may not seem like much to the naked eye, but when you look closer and learn the history, the truth becomes unveiled. Bahrain is one of these hotbeds, a seemingly quiet but prosperous country that harbors a tumultuous past. I'm Scott Parrish, and you're listening to Dying to Eat. The podcast delves into different cultures and nations of the world throughout time while exploring the different attitudes about death and food. If you love history, good eating, and fascinating stories, then I have a great show in store for you, so make sure you stick around to the end to see what's cooking this week. I'd also like to take a moment to thank our sponsor, thetailoredhemp.com. Healthline states research suggests that CBD shows promise in helping relieve pain and reduce inflammation, which could be useful to athletes participating in intense exercise. So if you're a serious athlete or a weekend warrior and you want high-quality CBD, reach out to thetailoredhemp.com. Now on with the show. Not many people know where Bahrain is, and partially that's because it's rather small. If you look at the Arabian Gulf, you'll see the bigger countries like Saudi Arabia, Oman, Kuwait, and then you get to a small archipelago above Qatar, and you've reached Bahrain. Bahrain is made up of 33 natural islands. However, extensive land reclamations have actually increased the size of Bahrain by about 40 square miles, or about 100 square kilometers, and increased the island count to about 84 with artificially constructed islands and inlets. Nonetheless, the entire country at its longest is only about 48 kilometers and about 16 kilometers wide. The largest island, Bahrain Island, makes about 83% of the country's landmass and contains the country's capital, Manama, a modern-day architectural metropolis with tall, enticing skyscrapers, each one almost competing with the other to show superior design and elegance. The country is divided into 12 municipalities and 5 different governorates. The vast majority of people live in the north, specifically in the capital, Manama, and adjacent towns right next to it. The south governorate is barely populated, and less than 100,000 inhabitants stay there. The government wants to change that, though, and has been developing civil engineering projects to lure the population to spread through the outer secluded regions of the country. For example, constructing a water park in the middle of the desert and a massive $6 billion project called Durat al-Bahrain, the largest artificial island residence located right at the southernmost tip of the country. Seriously, go look at the pictures of this project. It's really pretty wild. The most confusing part of Bahrain's geography would have to be Hawar Islands. That's part of the southern governorate. These islands are a group of islands that, although at the closest, are less than 2 kilometers from Qatar, where a source of lots of territorial disputes happen and do belong to Bahrain. Now, although Bahrain is an island, they do have access to Saudi Arabia by the King Fahd Causeway, built in 1986. The bridge was a huge deal, in which prior to its construction, the only way people could get to Bahrain was by a 30-minute flight or long ferry ride. Since then, the two countries have never been closer together, both literally and figuratively. Now, Bahrain is in the process of building another bridge between them and Qatar, currently referred to as the Friendship Bridge. After completion, it will be the world's longest fixed causeway. Now, looking at a satellite map, you would think that Bahrain doesn't really have much to offer other than sand. To be fair, it is pretty flat. It's dry desert with no forest. However, there is a tree of life standing in the South Governorate all by its very own lonesome. It's the oldest and only major tree growing in the entire area, serving as a tourist destination. But what's really impressive about this tree is that it's been dated to be over 400 years old. As far as trees go, that's a long time. Bahrain is one of the 18 countries in the world that doesn't have any rivers, natural lakes, and it rarely rains there. Yes, about 92% of the country is desert. However, they do have a few of somewhat wetter and milder areas along the west coast. So, how do they get their water? Well, Bahrain is lucky because it's located on the Damar Aquifer, a region that soaks up water from the porous rocks and sands and distributes the water through underground a network of springs in multiple regions. That water is then extracted and purified at salinization plants. However, drought remains a very common problem for the country, and it's not uncommon for huge dust storms to engulf the entire region. Not unlike what we learned from our Angola episode, Bahrain has not put all of their hope into their oil industry. Over the past few decades, they have diversified their revenue to various categories, including banking, finance, machinery, and even tourism. In fact, according to the Economic Index of Freedom, Bahrain has the freest economy in the Middle East, especially after signing a free trade agreement with the U.S. in 2005. In 2006, the UN cited Bahrain as the fastest growing economy in the Arab world, even passing the United Arab Emirates. Now, when it comes to the population, Bahrain is pretty strange because it's one of the few countries in which expatriates or exiled persons outnumber the nationals. With about 1.2 million people, Bahraini nationals only make up about 46% of the population, and expats make up about 55%. The most common nationalities of expats are Indians, Bengalis, Pakistani, Filipino, and Indonesians. The funny thing about that, although, is that Arabic is the official language. Most of the population has to learn English because that's the universal language which nationalists and expats use, and of course even tourists, so that they can communicate. This makes Bahrain a very English-friendly country. Freedom of religion is allowed, however. If one were to apply for Bahraini citizenship, it would be much easier for a Muslim to be accepted, as the country is still predominantly run by a Muslim parliament and a Sunni Muslim royal family. Did I forget to mention that Bahrain is a monarchy? In fact, the formal name Bahrain is the Kingdom of Bahrain, currently under the rule of King Hamad bin Az Al Khalif. Man, that's a super long name. But he's a big, powerful, rich guy, so he can have 4 or 5 names. This monarchy is actually very new, and it actually just started in 2002. Some people will say that it's a constitutional monarchy, and some will say that it's an absolute monarchy. Hamad bin Ida actually comes from a long line of people known as the Al Khalif family, which has, in some uncertain terms, had a dynasty over the country for 3 centuries. However, each head of state only gave himself the title Hakim, which means something along the lines of national caretaker, or Emir, which means chief. After his father died, Hamad bin Ida took over the role of the second Emir, with his father being the first Emir, then later officially proclaiming himself as King of Bahrain. I guess he just skipped the job interview, right? So, I don't know. This was taken with some mixed reviews, of course, and some liked it and some didn't. Others that particularly didn't like it were the Shia Muslims, which make up the slight majority of the country's Muslim population. Complaints about the king and how he administered national affairs started to boil, and after an uprising in Egypt in the late 2000s, many Bahraini citizens jumped in and things got a little heated. The country saw some of the worst clashing and protesting that it's ever seen in years. It got so bad that eventually they had to tear down the famous Pearl Monument, which was a common meeting spot for the protesters during the rallies. Today, most of the drama settled, but you still might get a rock thrown here and there. Bahrain made history in 2004 as they opened the first Formula One Grand Prix in the Middle East. Every year, they hold a race, an event that draws a huge international audience. Unlike its dry neighbors, Bahrain allows the consumption of alcohol. I'm sure many of Bahrain's visitors are citizens from the surrounding countries that just want to have a drink and not be really noticed. Speaking of its neighbors, let's talk about them. Because of the large number of expats in Bahrain, the country maintains good relationships with India, Pakistan, Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines. But when it comes to business, Bahrain knows how to play their cards. Turkey and the U.S. are among their top business partners, and they've even allowed the U.S.'s Fifth Fleet to station themselves in the Bahrain territory. Now, when it comes to the U.K., things are, well, let's just say Bahrain was under British status of protection for a period of time, and although the British did some great development projects such as building various schools and hospitals, roads, and things like that, the British did not treat their citizens as well as maybe they should have. Eventually, Bahrainians became tired of British occupation, and in 1971, the UK relinquished Bahrain, and to this day, despite the history, they still get along relatively well, unlike their relations with Iran. Let me put it this way. Iran really wants Bahrain, and like a clingy stalker who just won't take no for an answer, it's made things really awkward. In 2007, Hossein Shehramotori, advisor to the Ayatollah, called for a stand to incorporate Bahrain as another province of Iran. Bahraini were a little weirded by this, understandably, since it sounded a lot like what Saddam Hussein said about Kuwait back in the 90s. To make things worse, a lot of Bahrainians were torn between alliances. For one, the slight majority of Muslims were Shia, so theologically, they affirm Iran's view. However, a lot of Shias were actually Arab and not Persian, which caused a whole new set of drama. If it wasn't confusing, a lot of the Sunni Muslims, specifically the politicians and businessmen, actually have ties or even came from Iran. Bahrain is also busy hosting a plethora of visitors from Saudi Arabia who are known to travel to Bahrain in large groups to spend their time partying and drinking in Manama. Now that we've taken a look at the inner and outer workings of Bahrain, let's take a turn and dig into their past. Bahraini history begins with Domin civilization back in 3000 BC. The Domin were noted for being a seafaring people, trading with many different entities around the ancient world, connecting the ancient kingdoms of Mesopotamia to the Indus River Valley civilization. This made Domin very rich, and not just in currency. Many different cultures would mix and blend together with merchants that came from all over the ancient world. Trading in the Domin Bahrain at this time would often be described as a paradise, having far more plant life, and there's actually some historical debate if the richness found in this country was actually the inspiration for the Garden of Eden written about in the Bible and Abrahamic faiths. Towards the end of the 1000 BCs, the Domin civilization found itself coming under foreign occupation, but still remained an important trading port for centuries to come. Bahrain, starting in the ancient classical era, would see rule from several different Persian dynasties. The Persians, who arrived, often gave a more Persian character to Bahrain and gave greater connections to the Persian world. Bahrain, under Persian rule, would begin to work in the pearl industry of all places. Around Bahrain, there's a large abundance of oysters, and these oysters produce some of the finest pearls in the world. Up until the 20th century, the pearl industry was the backbone of Bahraini economy. During the Middle Ages, Bahrain would become Islamic. It was one of the first areas to convert to Islam, with much of its population converting around 328 CE. The Middle Ages would see Bahrain become Arabized with the conversion to Islam, and several different Muslim dynasties would rule Bahrain. One of the most interesting of these would be Karmatians. Now, to fully explain who Carmatians are and all of the crazy ideological and religious motivations behind their rise to power would probably take hours. I'll try to be brief, and hopefully this won't be confusing. So the Carmatians were an Islami Shia Islamic group that opposed the Sunni rulers of the region. The Carmatians staged a revolt in 899, and this led them to taking much of the east half of Arabia, where they established this strange kind of pre-liberal republic, which apparently had many segments of society not paying taxes in an economy dominated by African slave labor. The Carmatians would actually sack the holy city of Mecca, taking an important Islamic relic known as the Black Stone in 931. Now, Carmatians at one point found a Persian man who they believed to be the Mahdi, or a mythical savior, who was supposed to end the world and lead all Muslims to paradise. But the guy they found wasn't Muslim at all. He was Zoroastrian. Now, Zoroastrian, we're going to talk about that in a different episode. And to be frank with you, the reason that we haven't approached it yet is it's so dang hard to figure out what those guys ate. I don't know what I'm going to cook, but we'll get back to that. Zoroastrian people represent a religion that was widely popular in Iran. He started preaching Zoroastrianism, insulting Allah and Muhammad and basically all Muslims in general. So after only 80 days of rule, he was promptly killed, damaging the legitimacy of the state. By 1076, the Carmatians were kicked out of Bahrain. Several other Islamic polities would rule the region, including the Uyyinid dynasty, the Uesferdi, and Zarbred dynasties. The Zarbreds would be overthrown in 1521 by the Portuguese. It just seems like the Portuguese have their fingers in everything when we're talking about ancient history. Man, those sailors, they knew how to get around. So the Portuguese during this time in their history, they were traveling all over the world in the age of discovery. They set out to see the pretty sights as well as gain economic control over many important trade routes throughout the world. Bahrain, being a fairly rich trade port and having a thriving economy, looked perfect to the Portuguese. They took the country after an invasion and ruled for around 80 years, mostly taking a hands-off approach to the governance due to the difficulties in transporting soldiers to the islands. After Portuguese rule, the Safavids of Iran would take control of Bahrain. You may remember the Safavids from our Azerbaijan episode, but here's a little refresher. The Safavids were a Persian dynasty who managed to unite Iran and much of the Persian world and converted much of the population to Shiism. Bahrain had, since the days of Carmatians, a decent Shia population, but Safavid rule would increase the predominance of Shiism with more people converting to it and Shia clerics holding much of the political power in Bahrain. The Safavids, like the Portuguese, chose to indirectly rule the country, hiring locals to carry out much of the administrative work. For the first 100 years of Safavid rule, Bahrain would prosper. But after an invasion from Oman in 1717 and several years of back-and-forth conflict, much of Bahrain was depopulated. I think you should read depopulated into a bunch of people were killed, but let's not go too far down that right now. This point in time would see a lot of unrest, and as different Arab tribes, local rulers, and even an occasional European would try to gain footholds in the region and gain access to the lucrative trade in the Gulf. In 1753, with unrest throughout the Persian realm, Bahrain came under the rule of Nasser al-Miakuru. Nasser managed to take several cities in the Persian Gulf, and Bahrain, while still remaining as a puppet king to the Persian Shahs, Nasser only managed to rule for several years, but Bahrain was invaded in 1783 by Qatar-based tribes known as the Bani Ubaha. One of the clans of this tribe, the Sunni Alfiya, would manage to take control of the country, establishing a monarchy, calling themselves the first Hakmun of Bahrain. The Caliph would bring Sunni to power in the country, although Sunni would remain the minority. But while the Caliph were in control of Bahrain, they were still fraught with danger all around them. Rival tribes would fight for control of the region, and Persians, Omans, and Ottomans all had eyes on Bahrain, hoping to take over this series of islands. However, a new player entered the region, one which Bahraini hoped they could establish their independence. We've mentioned them before. Were you paying attention? That would be the British Empire. During the 19th century, the British Empire was growing throughout the world, and the Middle East looked like just another great place to go and colonize. Starting in 1820, Bahrain would sign a series of treaties with Britain that recognized the caliphs as the rulers of Bahrain, but giving the British an increasing amount of control of Bahraini foreign policy. After a disastrous war between Bahrain and Qatar in 1868, Bahrain signed away its independence by making Bahrain a protectorate of the British Empire, although with the caliphs still being given a large degree of self-autonomy. Modernization would come to Bahrain in the early 20th century by building up the capital, Munawwara, and someone out there might want to tell me if I'm pronouncing that correctly. I believe I am. They abolished slavery and set up schools in the country and started to drill for oil in the 30s, while ominously bringing in foreign troops to police Bahrain's streets to quell any unrest. Oil would change the economy for the country as the pearl industry in Bahrain began to die off due to the rise in the Japanese pearl industry. Oil instead would be highly valued because, well, it's oil, right? It makes just about all the modern machinery work. Speaking of which, a new type of modern machinery would enter the country, the battleship. The British would set up a naval base on the island to help secure their interest in the region. But despite all of these changes and ruling elites becoming fabulously wealthy, a growing discontent began to emerge in Bahrain. This wealth was concentrated in the upper crust of the society, while pretty much everyone else gained nothing. Bahrain also experienced new competing ideologies that rocked much of the Arab world. Pan-Arabism, or the idea that the Arabic world would unite to throw off the Western influence, became a predominant ideology among much of the intellectual class. Slowly, leftist groups began to emerge from the country. In 1965, an uprising broke out in much of the country, and with recently laid-off petroleum workers, leftists, and students occupying several parts of the country before being put down by British colonial forces. The British eventually realized that they couldn't hold on to the Persian Gulf colonies. In 1971, they left, giving independence to Bahrain. However, in many ways, things would remain the same. The Caliph would remain in power and gave themselves the name Emir. Briefly, a limited democracy was introduced with an elected parliament, although it would quickly be dissolved in 1975. Government forces were also given legal authority to take pretty much anyone off the street and hold them for as long as they liked. Sunni Muslims in general would continue to dominate politically and economically. Even Bahrain's role as a naval base would remain. While Britain left in 1971, the U.S. Navy arrived soon after, using it as a base to stage further military operations in the Persian Gulf. Bahrain remains a rich country, despite all of the inequality and tension present in it. It slowly began to move away from oil production and began turning to finance and banking. Ultimately, the country found itself living the high life, and slowly people began to immigrate to the country looking for work. Though the country still had its own share of struggles leading up to today, it still remains one of the richest countries in the world with a fast-growing economy. But there's one more thing about Bahrain that they can really boast about. having one of the largest and oldest cemeteries in the world. Interesting, huh? The Domen burial mounds, built between 2200 and 1750 BC, span over 21 archaeological sites in the western part of the island. 6 of these sites are burial mound fields consisting of a few dozen to several thousand interned. In all, there are about 11,700 burial mounds. Archaeological evidence shows that the burial sites were originally not constructed as mounds, but as cylindrical low towers. The royal mounds, characterized by their pronounced sizes and elaborate burial chambers, were constructed as 2-storied towers forming a ziggurat-like shape. 2 of the last Domen kings have been identified as Rimun and Yala-el in relation to the royal mounds 8 and 10. The Domen burial mounds illustrate globally unique characteristics not only with regards to their numbers, density, and scale, but also in the terms of construction, typology, and details such as their alcove-equipped burial chambers. As remains of settlements were scarce and buried under thick layers of soil, the Domen burial mounds are the most extensive and most apparent evidence of early Domen culture. At the time, the newly gained prosperity allowed the island's ancient inhabitants to develop an elaborate burial tradition applicable to the entire population. The excavated mounds provide a cross-section of various social groups in the early Domen society, attesting to thousands of individuals of different age, gender, and social class. They also offer crucial evidence on the evolution of elites and ruling classes. The ancient inhabitants of Bahrain understand the special geological configuration of the island and used less fertile land for the development of these extraordinary cemeteries. Because they are so old, there isn't much to indicate exactly how the burial rites were performed. But I can imagine that it was probably some delicious food involved, because otherwise, why would we be talking about it, right? And of course, that brings me to my favorite part of this show. That's the cooking. Ballalit is a sweet and savory dish, which is the traditional breakfast in that area. Now, I'm telling you, this is not the traditional recipe. While simple, it is delicious either way. The traditional dish is contrasting flavors that brings together both sweet and savory elements. It's prepared with vermicelli that are sweetened with cardamom, saffron, and rose water, then topped with this thin egg omelet. Now look, it's great, but my version, it goes like this. To make 4 servings, you need 12 ounces of vermicelli, 2 tablespoons of unsalted butter, 2 large garlic cloves, minced, a half of a small white onion, diced, and 4 eggs, and of course salt and pepper to taste. In boiling water, cook the vermicelli for about 3 minutes and drain it and set it aside. In a frying pan, melt 1 tablespoon of butter over medium-high heat. Sauté the garlic and onion until fragrant. Then add the vermicelli with the other tablespoon of butter and flash fry for about 2 minutes. Now divide that into 4 portions. Fry the eggs sunny side up and place 1 egg on each portion. Then it's just time to eat. And let me tell you, it is worth eating. It's a great breakfast. So with that, I'm your host, Scott Parrish, and I'd like to thank you for listening to Dying to Eat. I really hope you enjoyed this episode, which was co-written and researched by Nellie Grace, edited and produced by producer Pete. This show is made possible by listeners like you. I'd like to give some of you a special shout out. Galleries.coins, surfer_silver1977, and D.W. Harkrow. Your support drives the show, and we enjoy hearing from you. Find us on Facebook and Instagram at Dying to Eat Podcast. Let us know what topics you'd like to hear, and find future and past episodes on your favorite podcast platform. Make sure to drop us a like, give us 5-star rating, and don't forget to hit the subscription button to stay updated on the latest episodes. Until next time, stay lively.